Welcome to the Learning Project Network, where we learn through stories to make a change. The Learning Project Network, an organization dedicated to social justice issues. We are dedicated to learning about issues that impact children, families, and communities to help start conversations that lead to solutions. We believe that through storytelling and peer support, individuals can better understand how experiences lead to outcomes.
Hey everybody, it's Stephanie back with the Learning Project. I am so glad to be here today. It's snowing outside, you guys, here in Spokane, Washington. I know, right, Em? I have a special guest, Em. I got a good cup of coffee for those that are watching the video. It's good. You got water, right? You said you had water this morning? Yeah, she's got her water. I'm being bad this morning. I really needed it. So I just want to say welcome back to the Learning Project. I want to thank you so much for joining us again today for an amazing conversation. You know how we do, guys. We bring different stories to our community to learn and grow from one another. I want to welcome Em to our podcast series. Let me tell you, you guys, you know I always have these crazy stories about how I meet people and all this other stuff. So Em was in a group that I was in. We were doing some discussions around race and community, and she's like, hey, she hits me up private message, like I say something, she said something, she private messaged me, and I'm like, hey, we just start talking, we exchange phone numbers, we end up at coffee, okay? And we just hit it off. Like, you know how like you meet people and you're just like, this is a great person. I want to stay connected with them. I want to help them. They want to help me along my journey. And Em, I just want to say you're a gem. I love everything that you're doing in the community. And you told me about a book that you were writing. And I was like, I have to have Em on this podcast to talk about this book that is getting ready to be launched and is going to be in the community. But before we jump into that, Em, tell us about who you are and who are you and what do you do?
Okay. Well, all easy questions. Who am I and what do I do? Nothing existential. I mean, it's snowing. It's really beautiful. I mean, we're all going to hate it in like 2 weeks, but today it's very beautiful.
Truth.
So my name is Em Daniels. I am a master educator. I've been working with adult students for probably close to 25 years now. And I am an artist in my in another part of my life, although that is starting to bleed over into my professional life. It is. So I grew up in a military family. I spent most of my young adulthood living in the South, and then moved to Portland in 2004 to go to graduate school, and was there for 13, 14 years, and moved to Spokane in 2017. And that was both of those moves. The one I was living in North Carolina, I moved to Portland. I couldn't even believe I was living in the same country. And then it took me a year or two to acclimate to that. I bet. If you haven't made a move like that, it's very difficult to describe like how disorienting it is.
Oh yeah.
But Portland is where I like grew up and became a mature adult person. And so it really had a huge impact on who I am and how I think about the world. And the graduate school that I went to, I was extraordinarily lucky to be with the people that I was with. I didn't do a particular I actually created my own graduate program because I wanted to study peace education. Mm-hmm. And there was no program for peace education. So I just created my own and I got a really good education and I got a giant pile of debt that will probably never go away. But that just puts me in good company because I know many people who have a whole lot of
yeah.
And so I worked I worked as a TA in grad school. So I was teaching at Portland State University, and then I went to work at Portland Youth Builders, which is an alternative high school. I was there for about 2.5 years. And then recession hit and I was not there. So I was scrambling around for a few years. Mm-hmm. And then I went to work at Portland Community College and did a bunch of different things with them. But the last thing I did with them was I worked in the Oregon Women's Prison for several years, running a career and technology training program. And that I left that position near the end of 2015 and then bumped around a little bit longer before I came up to Spokane. And I moved to Spokane to work as a reentry education navigator with a local institution that I am not going to say the name of because we did not part on good terms. And I'm not giving them any recognition or credit. So during that time, I met my sort of thought partner who helped me start thinking about this work that I had actually started thinking about in grad school. How do we work with adults in a different way? How do we change the dynamics in the classroom? And at that time, I didn't have the capacity to think about, there wasn't language, there wasn't any conversation about it. It was like this just wisp of an idea that somehow we could be teaching differently or learning differently or something. And so I just sort of pursued it off and on. And then when I met Bill Kaiser, who was here in town at the time, and now he is married to a traveling nurse. So he's like semi-retired, living the life, moving around, taking care of his lovely spouse, like all of that. So he's not local anymore, but we started looking at, we were originally talking about, we were putting together training to help people understand, like when folks come out of incarceration, how do we help them? How do we best help them in college classrooms? And just sort of like working through that, we came across Dr. Nadine Burke Harris's TED Talk on the impacts of trauma, and that was the first time. Like when I watched that, I was like, oh, this is the thing that is missing. Like we were initially talking about like, when people when people are incarcerated, there's a process that happens. It's the deliberate process called institutionalization. And it is designed so that a small group of people can control a large group of people. And so there's some very specific steps and it has some very specific results. So we originally thought we were talking about that, but we were like, there's something else. And then we saw this TED Talk and we were like, oh, that's what we're talking about. Talking about trauma. And then as we continue to look into it, we realized there was really nobody talking about trauma in adult classrooms and adult learning spaces. So over the course of probably 18 months, we did a lot of research on our own, a lot of discussion on our own. We did presentations, a bunch of presentations, and we were going to be working on it. We were going to continue working, but of course, COVID hit, and Bill ended up, they ended up changing sort of life and career circumstances. And in 2019, like in April, I had met Dr. Erin Corbett late in 2018 at a conference, and we were talking or something, and she's like, oh, I want to introduce you to this editor who helped me with something else. So I was connected to this editor at Rutledge and sent her 3 or 4 sentences about what I was wanting to write, because at that point it was still just kind of flopping around. You were playing around with different spaces. I was just like, oh, I think I want to write this book, and maybe I'll do that. And she was like, oh, I really like this idea. Can you submit a proposal? So I'm just going to say a nonfiction book proposal is a hell of a thing. Like it is a lot of work.
For everybody that doesn't even know what you're talking about, so tell me about, like, just in a short little clip, what is a proposal for a book? Like, what are you trying to explain or do to help somebody understand this?
Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways to do this. I'm not an expert, but I will give you what I do know. So books loosely fall into the categories of fiction and nonfiction. Mm-hmm. And there are places where that blurs. So my book falls into the realm of academia and nonfiction. Mm-hmm. So a nonfiction book proposal is different than what you would write for a fiction book. And even within fiction, it's going to be different if you already have written the book, or if you're partway through it, or if you just have an idea. So what I would recommend, instead of me, in terms of fiction, I can talk about nonfiction a little bit, but in terms of fiction, I would say if you have a book idea and you have it written, or you have an outline, or you have something that is more than just a wisp of an idea that if you're serious about it, you should look at book authors that you really like, that are in the same genre as you, or the same kind of writing as you. Look at who is publishing their work, and then go to that website, because they're probably going to have their guidelines for authors on how to submit your work. And if you look at that, then that will help you understand what you need to do to communicate your idea.
Okay.
So that's the best first step.
That's a really good brief breakdown. Like, for those that don't know, now you know, because I didn't know that. And I think that is really good for our listeners who are writers to think about, like, you know, when you're writing something. So you finish this proposal, and what happens next?
Yeah. So a nonfiction book is different, because with a nonfiction book, it has to go out to reviewers. So this is not true with fiction. This is why. So nonfiction, academia, stuff like that, it has to go out to reviewers. So I had to put together, like, what is the outline? What are the chapters going to look like? What are the subheadings going to look like? What is the premise and the hypothesis of the book? And then I had to tell them who my market was. I basically had to put together a marketing plan. So I had to say, here's the organizations that might be interested. Here are the conferences and whatnot that I might want to go to, blah, 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 blah. And then I also had to suggest like 3 or 4 people. No, I submitted like 15 people that they could send it out to. And then they submitted people, and they picked like 4 people and went out to review for. So, well, if you're an academic writer, it depends on your field. My field, the reviewers were very generous and didn't, beat me down, but definitely academic writers get a lot of beat down. So I was really lucky, and the proposal went out and was approved. And so once the reviewers send back their feedback, whatever it is, depending on what that is, I got to address it.
Yeah.
So I went back and said, oh, here's how I'm going to address these things. And then the editor that I was working with was like, okay, I'm going to take this to our editorial board and see if they want to extend a contract offer. And they did. So that happened in January of 2021.
Nice.
Yeah. I still was like, what's happening? And I had been writing like during this time, but it still had not really clicked in what was happening. And so I got the contract either end of January or February. And I was like, okay, it was due 2021, like in May. So I was like, oh, I have like 15 months. And I started writing, and then COVID hit. And I had only been writing for about 6 weeks, lost about 3 months because there just was nothing. I just couldn't write.
Yeah.
And so I didn't really start digging in until like summer of 2020. And that's when shit got real. And I was like, oh, I have to write this. I have to, like, all of this stuff I've been thinking about, and all of these hundreds and hundreds of books and articles and videos and social media posts and all. I have to like put this together in some kind of coherent thing. And I got through the rest of 2020, and then at the beginning of 2021, I ended up having the falling out with my employer at the end of January. And so, so the next 5 months, I really don't remember. I don't remember them. They were just a combination of like finishing up the work that I was supposed to do. And I don't remember them. Like, it was the hardest thing I've ever done.
Oh, what you're telling me is that you were writing and throwing yourself into your work after you just went through something crazy.
Well,
that is what so many people do. I even do it. Like, if I go through something, I literally will throw myself into my work, and when I just bury myself, and that's kind of where I find sometimes my best work. And so 5 months it took you to write this book.
It took a year, but the last 5 months were were probably more intense, because not only did I have to finish, because one of the things I wanted to say, I was looking at, I know you sent me some prompt questions, and I was thinking about like this in terms of writers. So one of the things that I hear from writers, people who are writing, like whatever that is they're like, well, I have this chapter and I just want to make sure that it's right before I get on to the rest of it. I'm like, you got to leave that shit behind.
Yep.
You need to write you need to just write. You need to write whatever it is, because that first chapter, if you spend 5 years perfecting it and then you try to move on, like, it's going to change. It is going to change, because as you write, if you are, well, as I wrote, I can only talk about myself, because I had the same thing. I was like, oh, I'm gonna write this first, I want to make sure this is really good. And then I was just like, I remember reading 2 people, Stephen King and Anne Lamott. Stephen King wrote a book called On Writing, and Anne Lamott wrote Bird by Bird. And those are both 2, if you read no other books on writing, you read them. They're both fiction writers, memoir writers. They're
really good.
Yeah,
that Stephen King book is really good.
They're phenomenal. And anybody who has ever written will tell you the only thing you want to do is finish. You have to finish it, and you don't even have to. It doesn't have to be good, because you're gonna go back and you're gonna work on it. But if you don't finish it, you have nothing to work on.
Oh my gosh, we have to marinate on that, because a lot of times people will miss the mark on that. The only thing you have to do is finish. Wow. Yeah. That's deep.
That's the require. I mean, that is the only thing. If I were going to say to anybody who wanted to write, I would say you have to finish something, and then you can go back and you can work on it. But if you don't have the raw material to work on, you don't have anything. So you have to finish. And that was the piece. Like, I had to finish because I had a legal obligation to finish something, and so I wanted it to be good. So it was very hard. Even though I had about half of it written at the beginning of 2021. Finishing it was really challenging, because I had to invent new stuff. I had to invent ways to talk about stuff, because there just wasn't any way to talk about this work because nobody had written anything about it before. So
let me ask you this. If you were to sum up your book, what is your book about, and what part was the most challenging for you to write about?
So the book is about the impacts of trauma on adult learners. And my area of deep interest and expertise has been people that have been impacted by incarceration. But so that's kind of the use case in the book. So the book is about trauma and adult learners, but it's also about working in prison.
Yeah.
And what the sort of the mechanics of teaching in prison and working in prison. But that piece aside, the concepts that I lay out can be applicable in any situation where you need adult people to learn something, or they want to learn something. So setting aside the piece about prison, you can use it in almost any kind of learning situation. Yeah. So, and it ultimately ends up with what we can do if we have nothing else that we can do. If you're going into a learning situation or a teaching situation, is you can bring joy into your classroom. And you do that by you being joyful in yourself, not only in teaching, but wanting to learn with your students or wanting to learn with the other people that are in the class. And that may sound very simple, but
it's not.
When you look at the way that our educational systems are set up, they beat the joy out of you very early. They punish you. They punish so many people. Like, it's a very punitive education system, which is why it's an easy fit to transition Black and Brown and Indigenous people of color and disabled people into prison systems and into, I would say, foster care too. It's, I mean, it just is a good fit. Like, it's a very punitive system, and it fits right in with, prison, with the pipelines to prison. So the pieces that were hardest to write, there were two different categories of difficulty. One was creating new ways to think about things. Like, how do I present this in some kind of way? But that was like a challenge that was like stretchy, and it's the good challenge, like your muscles burn after a workout, right? So that was a good stretch, a good mental stretch. The part that was hard, that was not a pleasant after workout burn, that was more like a soul crushing kind of thing, was writing about working in prison. Because I put a note in the book about this. I mean, I'm an abolitionist. I don't think that prison in the way that we conceive of it right now should exist. And I know we're a long way from that, but I don't think that it should. I think that we have to find new ways to work with each other. And I'm not saying that there aren't times that people need to be separated from society for their own safety and the safety of others. But I'm saying the way that we have conceived of it right now is killing this country. And people do not understand, like, the enormous toll that our mass incarceration system is taking on this country, and is on not only physically and economically, but on the soul of our country. People do not understand that. So that piece of it, that chapter, the mechanics of working in prison, was incredibly hard, because it felt like I did not want to normalize something that should not be normalized. But you can't abandon people who are incarcerated. So it's our obligation, if we're going to work in prison, to do the best that we can. And that means people need to have information and understand.
I'm trying to keep myself together right now, Em. I really am, because let me tell you guys, so let me back up. So my mom introduced me to the prison system when she was doing prison ministry for women at Pine Lodge for women back in the day here in Spokane, Washington. And I remember going into this place. She started a program called Storytime Telling. And it was a chance for women to read a story on cassette tape, because this is back in the day. And they could read their story, send the book with the tape and a teddy bear to their child. Okay. So I was so intrigued by this whole program that she did. I was like, I want to be a part, Mom. So I was 18. I was able to be a part. Walked in there, and this lady is like bawling. Like, she is physically shaking. She's bawling. And my mom goes up to her and she says, "Babe, what's wrong?" And you're not supposed to touch inmates. You're not supposed to
let's call them incarcerated people.
Thank you. Can you actually talk about that really quick? Because that was something that I am working on in my language. And I don't think many people know about it, but I want to just put a pin on this story. Tell me why we need to change the language around that.
Well, people who are in prison are people. And when you start to use a label to refer to somebody, you immediately dehumanize them. So using words like felon and convict and inmate, like that's that's DOC language. That's Department of Corrections language. That's dehumanizing language.
Mm-hmm.
And that is unacceptable in any kind of justice work, in any kind of abolitionist work. People who have been incarcerated or who are incarcerated can use whatever language they want to refer to themselves.
Correct.
But when I have a classroom, if I have people, I've had this happen so many times. I would go into prison and people would talk and they would be like, well, we're felons. And I'm like, you're people. And when you're in this classroom, let's use the word people, and you can use whatever language you want to elsewhere. But like, while you're in here, you're people. And so that's the approach of people first language. So people with disabilities instead of disabled people. I think it would be one example, but I just think of it as formerly incarcerated people. If I can avoid even using the language around incarceration, I try to do that, because I just feel like there's so much stigma around it. And I want folks to feel like they are fully human and that I'm not thinking about them through that framework other than what they need.
I love it. I remember when you first told me this, and I told you, I said, let me know if I say it, because I want to be able to correct that verbiage. And this is the thing about the environment that we're in. Many of us have grown up with certain types of language or ideas and concept. That stuff is not going to go away overnight. You have to have people around you that can hold you accountable and do it in love, and be able to say, this is the reason why we're focusing on creating change. And as centuries and generations and history and things, we learned new things, we're going to change our language, and we have to be open to it so that we can understand the impact of words and the impact of how we affect other people. So I appreciate you explaining that to our listeners. And I'm still working on it, y'all. Ain't nobody perfect, okay? Nope. Ain't nobody perfect, and I ain't got no shame in my game, and I'm gonna do the thing. So back to the story, because I wanted you to hear that part, because M talked to me about that before, and I was like, oh my goodness, M, I've never heard a breakdown like that. So this lady's crying. My mom says, what's going on? Protocols typically tell you can't hug individuals. Right. You cannot get close to them. My mom was breaking all kind of rules. She just did not care. And the deputies and because it was like, it's kind of like they had to get extra people to come and help run this program.
Oh yeah, you have to have extra security with visitors and whatnot.
Yeah, like they had to get extra people to run this program, because literally they had more. It was something like 60 people wanting to be a part of the program so they could reach their child and get this stuff, out. And we usually did it before Christmas. So she's like, I don't know how to read. And I'm afraid that when people hear me read out loud, they're going to judge me. And my mom looked at her and she said, honey, she was like, you got this. And she goes, I will do it with you. She goes, I will whisper every word in your ear if you need me to. She goes, but your baby is going to hear your voice. And if you want me to read and then you send a message, whatever you feel comfortable with, you can do that. For me, that was the first time I understood how an adult was impacted by the educational system in such a negative way that they did not want to read to their child. And when we look at speech, when we look at literature, when we look at reading to your child, those pieces all come into play. And so when you were talking about what you were just saying, it made me think about that. And it made me really think about how we as individuals need to think about how we are embracing people, regardless if they're little or if they're adults, because everyone comes with different challenges and those challenges impact children. And so long story short, she was able to get through the recording and she just was just crying, because she was like, my daughter had never heard Like she
Wow.
never had heard her voice,
Wow.
because this was the first time that the grandmother was going to let her do something for her, because she was so worried about her being in and out of her life, because she was struggling with substance abuse, mental, just mental. She didn't even. It was really interesting, her story, but she wasn't sure if she had some mental health issues. She hadn't been diagnosed at that time, but she was just really going through a lot of trauma. And this trauma was impacting every aspect of her life. So when you wrote this book and you had these challenges, not even challenges, but like these pieces that really hit you hard, what was the part for you that you were like, I want people to understand individuals in a new light, and I want them to know this when they're teaching and when they're working with individuals?
So I think there's kind of two different answers to that. One is for people like when you're working with adult learners, or even some of this sort of can be applicable to children very broadly, like working with children very broadly. And the other is more specific to working in prisons. So the specific to working in prison is that when you are working, if you're teaching people in prison, or you're working with people who have just come out of prison, there's a doctor in Southern California. His name is Dr. James Garbarino, and he is a psychologist. He's an expert witness in the cases where children are being accused of murder. So children who have been accused of murdering other people. So he wrote a paper recently about the adverse childhood experiences scores of these children. And people generally in the US, I think that this is wrong. There's a Kaiser CDC study from back in the mid 90s. It's the first major study, longitudinal, like long-term study about trauma. And it's incomplete, it's ongoing, but it's kind of incomplete. But generally people in the US have at a minimum between 1 and 3 on the ACEs scale, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It's 10 questions. They're terrifying. If you want to look them up, you can do that, but prepare yourself, because they're pretty terrible. And I have some strong opinions about how the ACEs has turned into like an assessment tool for people, or a criteria for people to get services. That is so terrible and should not be happening. So if you are listening to this or watching this, I am telling you right now, if you are using the ACEs as a tool in any way outside of perhaps a one-on-one therapeutic relationship, you really need to reconsider what you're doing. So let me move on from that. So people who go to prison average about 6 on that scale. The children that he works with, that he has worked with, and he's been in trial with maybe 100 children who were ultimately convicted. They score between an 8 and a 10 on the ACEs scale. And the ACEs does not even measure the ACEs questions are grounded in mainly in like sexual assault and domestic violence. And so they don't even cover things like systemic racism, systemic misogyny, intergenerational trauma, the trauma that refugees and immigrants have to suffer, like people who are in foster care. Like they don't even cover all of those things. So these children, how would you, when you have a child who has suffered every single thing on a list like that, and probably more things beside, what response, like why would it surprise us that the only thing they know how to do is harm themselves and harm other people? That's all that's happened to them their whole life. They've been so hurt their whole life. So when you work with people in prison, even though certainly not all of them are like that, people don't come to prison because their lives have been good. They don't come to prison because their lives have been easy. There's probably been an enormous amount of trauma. Prison itself is traumatizing. So talking about trauma-informed care in a prison setting is, I don't know how people can do it, because it's as if you are talking about how do you care for someone as you are continually hurting them at the same time. So that's the piece I would want people to know. If you're going to go teach in prison, what you can do is going to be limited, but you can work within your limitations. But people are definitely traumatized. So making the assumption, like when I hear people say, oh, they don't want to work, they're just lazy, they're not interested. I'm like, that you don't know if that's true, because there's a whole bunch of different kinds of trauma. And educational trauma is the one that shows up in prison classrooms, in addition to all the other stuff. And that's the piece that we haven't had any way to talk about or address. But it is so fundamental to who we are as humans. We're learning beings. Like, we are on this planet in part because we learn. Like, that's just how we grow and develop. You learn something, you grow and you develop from that. So this is where it transfers back to working with children. So when you are working with children, if you are punishing them for how they understand and interact with the world, which is like, our schools are all really focused on Eurocentric ways of knowing and understanding the world. That's the way that our school systems have been set up. And so anybody who not only doesn't understand the world in that way, but cannot or will not assimilate, and also can't regurgitate content in exactly the correct way, they are punished. So not only are they punished because it's assumed they cannot learn, they're told that they're bad people. Like, those punishments are not only you're a bad learner, it's you're a bad person, you're wrong as a person because you can't learn this way. That is the message that our children get. So if you're told when you're a child that you are unable to learn and that you're wrong and that you can't change and you can't grow, like, at what point would if there's no specific intervention around that, why would that change when people become adults? And that isn't true for everybody.
Correct.
But it is true for a lot of children. And, I've worked with adults. So I've had thousands of adults, thousands of adults that I've worked with as learners. And so many of them, people are terrified to take any kind of risk in the classroom because they don't want to be shamed again. They don't want to be told they're wrong. They don't want to be told there's something, that they're a bad person because they have trouble learning. And those are the sort of two different things I would want people to really be thinking about.
Man, my mind is going like a million miles per hour because I'm thinking about all of the change that people are talking about and what some prisons are really pushing for, because they know this doesn't work. And it's like, how do you dismantle a whole structure when you know it's not working? And I think this is really hard because we're dealing with this in the educational system. We're dealing with this in our family structures. There's so many people that are saying we're going to raise our kids differently. We're going to think about children differently. We're going to see children, not just say, this child has to do exactly what I say, there's so many different pieces I'm thinking about right now. And I'm thinking about our prison system. Like, it's such a large entity that impacts so many people. And even people that don't even realize that it impacts. What can our communities do to make a difference and make a change, and maybe even petition for change that will help us see more positive long-term effects?
Well, that's a giant question. And
it is.
I think one of the reasons that it is so difficult to think about change, specifically with regard to mass incarceration, is because mass incarceration is sort of the bucket that is when everybody falls through or is pushed through all these other cracks. This is where they end up. So you have this massive intersection of economic disadvantage, systemic racism, misogyny, ableism against people, to some degree, homophobia and anti-trans, behavior. So there's, and then the foster care system, the education system, like all of these things come together and intersect in mass incarceration. So it's very difficult to say there is no one right way. I would say if I had to give like one piece of advice, I would say, remember that people who have been incarcerated are people, and that especially Black and Brown and Indigenous people and disabled people will be unfairly targeted. They will be unfairly incarcerated. And it doesn't mean that people don't make bad decisions and, maybe they have fucked up or something like that. But whether they deserve to go to a place where they get locked in a cage and women are shackled when they're giving birth, and people are just denied medical care until they have tumors the size of grapefruits, and all of these things that happen to them, like, is that really the kind of people that we want to be? And I'm like, that's not the person I want to be. So there's so many things that could happen that we could do change. Part would be, how do we look at change in education so that part of the pipeline gets closed? How do we look at change in the criminal legal system so that people are not being unfairly targeted? So some of that would be, for example, electing a progressive DA. Our DA is terrible and overcharged, but I mean, generally terrible. DAs are rewarded for conviction. So when you talk with people who have been incarcerated about their experience with the DA, do you know how many people actually get a jury trial? I mean, where a right to a jury trial is supposed to be one of our foundational rights, right? Less than 5%.
Wow.
And if you want a jury trial in Washington, you have to pay for it. It's part of the court fees. Yeah, it's part of the court fees. That was. It's possible that's changed, but that was the case a few years ago. So
I've heard something similar.
Yeah.
But
So
I haven't heard it like that. So yeah.
Yeah. So if you get picked up and you get charges, then a lot of times a DA will come in and they'll be like, well, they'll stack up your charges. You're like, well, you could potentially get 50 years. Or if you plea out, then you end up getting 5 years. And that happens all the time to people. And you're talking about people who maybe they're confused, they may be hurt, they may have the percentage of people who have traumatic brain injuries in prisons is anywhere from like 30 to 60%. In the general population, it's less than 10.
Wow.
So when you think about the impacts of a traumatic brain injury, and then you think about that person is sitting there trying to decide, should I take to a trial to jury or should I take this plea? How can people, if people don't have the medication that they need, or if they're detoxing because, they were using substances, like all of the things that happen with folks when they are picked up and taken to jail.
Wow.
And I just think, so that's the criminal legal system. And then corrections is its own aspect of that. So when people talk about police reform, there's almost no conversation about reform of law enforcement inside of prisons. And that's just rampant with corruption. I mean, you're literally putting people in a position of full authority over other people's bodies and well-being. And that is never a good situation. It's never good. And I'm not going to tell stories about being in prison because I haven't lived there. I only work there. But there are a lot of people who are writing about and sharing their experience about being in prison, and it is horrifying. And we are paying for that. We are paying for that. The amount of money that we put into prisons and jails at the state and local and federal level every year, how deeply that is tied into our economics, how deeply it's tied into our politics. The location of prisons is political. It's not just economic, it's political.
Wow.
And So, I mean, these are all issues I talk about, most of them in the book, not deeply, but I try to like lay out for people.
Yeah.
These are all these different places that you can do work. I mean, if you're interested in reform, then try not to be overwhelmed. Try to think about like what are you interested in personally?
Mm-hmm.
And then how can that connect to some of this larger work that can be done? For people who say, well, I'm not political. Yes, you are. If you think that you are not political, then there is some level of privilege that is allowing you to sidestep that. And there are going to be ways that you're impacted by this. We all are. If you think about the amount of money that gets spent on prisons, think about if we put that into our schools. Think about if we put that into changing climate disaster. Like, think about if we put that into community care and mutual aid, so that people could walk into a community center and get help that they need and not have to wait 18 months for a therapist. Think about all of that. If you think that you are not impacted by this, you are wrong. You are. And you're welcome to talk to me. I will.
Let me tell you guys, this conversation was something that I wanted to add on to the series, because there's so many times that we're missing information. And a lot of times too, like I'm a type of person, I like to hear different perspectives. I like to hear different thoughts. This stuff is not new, but it's finally being written about. And it's finally giving us some perspective and ideas to think about when we are making choices and where we're putting our dollars and how we're using those dollars. There's so many times that we miss opportunities to make real change. And part of that is us not understanding who we are and acknowledging how we can make an impact in our community by using information that will help us make those decisions. I have something. What do you got?
I do. So I have 2 books. If you're interested in this work, these are probably 2 places you can start. And Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which is about 10 years old.
Yes.
That's sort of the first definitive text on mass incarceration, but Bettina Love and Mariam Kabe wrote these 2 recently, and these are more abolitionist, with an abolitionist focus. So I think that these are good starting places for people if they really are interested in doing any kind of justice reform work. Whether you're interested specifically in mass incarceration or anything else, just to have a grounding in the ideas and the framework, like the direction that justice work is sort of moving. I think these are really good starting points.
I love it. Thank you so much for sharing those resources.
Yeah.
So you guys, we are coming to the end of our podcast. I want to say, if you need anything, if you have questions, M is like an open book. So where can people find you? How can they connect with you? And where can they buy your book that's being released pretty soon here?
Well, you can get the book is supposed to start shipping in 11 days.
Woo-hoo!
So December 17th is supposed to be ship day. You can find it on Amazon. It's building a trauma responsive educational practice, lessons from a corrections classroom. It's also available on Routledge. If you're an academic and you want a desk copy, you probably want to go to the Routledge link and you can request the desk copy for review. So you can find that there. You can find me at mem@joyseedconsulting.com. You're welcome to email me, and I'm happy to, provide what information I can. I'm assuming that Stephanie, I can work with Stephanie to get some stuff in the show notes, maybe some more reference materials in the show notes and a link to the book. But I feel really strongly about this. And remember that when people have conviction histories, that conviction is a snapshot of for most people, one of the worst moments of their lives. And right now, we keep them fossilized in that moment. And everybody's like, well, I don't want this person with this background around my kid, or I don't want them here and I don't want them there. And the more that we treat people as inhuman, the less humanity they are able to share with us. But that's not necessarily on them. We bear responsibility for that too. So it's our job. If you can't do anything else, if there's no other way that you feel called to be of service or to do work, then just try to remember that these are human beings and you don't know the story that led up to what brought them into incarceration. You don't know what they're going through when they're out. And many people who were incarcerated were also victims and did not have people to stand up for them. So this is part of us remembering our shared humanity and trying to have a more restorative approach and a more compassionate approach.
Absolutely.
All right.
Hey guys, I want to thank you so much for listening today. It has been a pleasure having you on this podcast series. Y'all, this has been a heavy topic today, but we needed to have it and I wanted to share it. So without further ado, I'm sending you guys all the strength and love. Let me know if you need anything, and Tim is here to definitely answer your questions if you have any. Until next time, see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
You guys, this was such a great podcast with M. Daniels, the author of Building a Trauma Responsive Educational Practice. You gotta get this book. I definitely plan on reading it myself so that I can grow and develop as a leader. We have so much work to do in our community and we have to do it together. So remember to connect with M, buy that book, have that conversation, and make a change in your community. Until next time, you guys, see you soon.